like we've been sending press releases for like 15 years or more now. Do you think journalists actually read them?
Oh gosh, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The majority of press releases, they have only read the email subject matter. And if you have not grabbed them with that headline in the email subject matter, they're probably never going to open your email.
Hi, I'm Nan from Bridges M&C. We're a medical and healthcare communications agency, and today we're talking about re-examining the press release. So for the longest time, I think since I started my career and since I knew what PR was or is, we've been issuing press releases actually. And here with me, I have regional account director for Bridges M&C, and he can introduce himself. Yes.
Hi, my name's John, and as Nan said, I'm one of the regional account directors with Bridges.
So we are here to re-examine the press release, and let's define it for everyone. A press release is basically a document that you send out. A company could send it out, and an individual could send it out to the press. And it usually includes some sort of an announcement. If there is an announcement of a product launch or an announcement of an event, or maybe an executive appointment that you need to release a press release or send a press release out to the media. And the general idea behind a press release, or as far as I know it, from when I started working in PR, is that it is meant to generate coverage. That's a whole sole idea of generating press releases. So what's your experience with the press release as a journalist?
Well, I've had good and bad experiences. Having been a journalist formerly, I know I received far too many press releases, and sometimes ones which weren't at all relevant to my beat.
Right. And one of the things, I think one of the pet peeves of, being a journalist, I was a writer for a short period of time. And one of the things that we do not like journalists doing to us is sending us press releases with incomplete information. For example, if there is an event, they miss out dates and times and locations, that sort of thing. So what is the function of a press release? And can you generate sustained coverage from issuing press releases?
Well, I think the function of a press release is for disseminating time-sensitive news and information. So that's for an upcoming event, the appointment of a new CEO, release of figures, that sort of thing. It's not really designed for sustained coverage. There are better tools in our toolbox for that. So for sustained coverage, there are better tools. I'm sure you could think of a few.
Well, I think I'd like to cycle back a little bit to think about, what is the purpose of the press release to start. Most marketeers want to generate coverage around specific events, and that's when a press release would be very helpful. But usually in between major announcements, if you want to keep the company in the news, if you want to keep a product in the news, then you'll have to do a lot more than just generating a press release. We would need to think of angles, for example, like interview opportunities with key opinion leaders, for example, or thought leaders or influencers even. And that's how you can continue to generate coverage in spite of not having rather, specific events or announcements, that would need time-sensitive press releases. So you have been in the media for some time before joining PR. So what are the things that you've noticed in good press releases and bad press releases before you join the dark side?
Okay, so I think the worst thing is many companies just blast out their press releases to everybody and anybody. And that can be very irritating if you're a busy journalist and you're receiving dozens of press releases which are just not relevant to what you do. Mm-hmm. I used to work in the oil and gas industry, so I'm really not interested in press releases about new restaurants or things like that.
Yes, and one of the things that I do notice about how journalists respond to press releases is if you offer them multiple ways of generating the coverage. For example, so if you offer them like a press release, but you also offer them, let's say, an interview opportunity, you also offer them a treatment review or an opportunity to try a treatment if you're doing, say, aesthetic medicine or injectables. So there are different ways for them to approach a story. It's not just by repeating a piece of information in whatever space that they have. So then they can actually think about how they want to shape the content, so that actually helps them think about how they want to present
Well,
it.
I'd agree with that. I think the press release has evolved considerably in the last couple of decades. It used to be that a written press release was all you need, but nowadays we nearly always offer photos, sometimes even video clips or animations, as you say, interview opportunities or invitations to come down for a site visit or a trial of a product or whatever.
Yeah, and certainly at Bridges M&C, one of the things that we do is that whenever we have to present certain things like facts and statistics, and if we think that it might further or advance our cause in terms of generating coverage, we sometimes create the infographics ourselves and present it to the journalists. Obviously, it would have to be referenced, make sure that the sources are referenced so that they will be more amenable to generating the coverage or be able to see in what forms it can be presented. Maybe we can talk about how press releases are being received in different countries, like for Singapore and Malaysia, for example, and then we can move out to ASEAN and APAC. So what has been your experience with that?
Well, in Singapore, we always, I won't say hand deliver, but we personally target press releases. So there are basically only two media companies in Singapore, and we know most of the relevant journalists and editors, producers and show bookers and so on that we want to reach. So we can email them personally and directly. When you go to countries with a bigger media landscape like Thailand, Taiwan, and so on, then it's worth using a delivery service that reaches out to more media because they have a larger media landscape and a lot more titles these days, especially digital titles.
And I think some media are just more amenable to running press releases as is, compared to some other media who tend to be more focused on generating, let's say, interviews or like video coverage, for example. So some media, I know, for example, B2B media, if there is a drug launch or it has been newly approved or a new executive appointment, they are more likely to just run the press release as is. So we don't really need to present them with opportunities like interview opportunities or infographics. But in the instance where, these are B2B media, they are like, if you go out of Singapore, Malaysia into the Asia Pacific, for example, in places like Thailand, they do run press releases, I believe. I think they still do run press releases ad verbatim to some extent. A few of them might actually pick up the story angle and decide to pursue the story by having an interview or so. But most of them actually do just lift the information from the press release. So some places where the media scene is not as what do you call that, as advanced or sophisticated, this is what the media tends to practice. So moving out from countries like Thailand, where the media are, they are pretty much, very established. The journalists have been there for many, many years. So what happens then when you go out to even bigger cities, like, for example, India and China, or bigger countries like those?
Well, now, in those big countries, that's where a press release can really work. I mean, there are cities in China, dozens of cities in China with bigger populations than Singapore. And each one of them has its own newspapers, its own radio stations, and many of them even have their own TV companies. So there you can send out a press release and generate literally hundreds of pickups. And similarly in India as well, we have great success with press releases in India.
Now we can talk about translations as well. I think one of the things that make working in healthcare, especially in PR in various countries across the region, is that we do need to localize the press releases. We do need to translate them. What are the idiosyncrasies and what are the things that we need to look out for when we generate a press release and translate them for the local media?
Right. Well, yes, obviously we have to translate, and sometimes translations can be quite tricky. For instance, Chinese. In the medical field, we've discovered that doctors may be using different terms for the same thing in Chinese in Singapore, Taiwan, China, Hong Kong. They've all got a different term.
Mhm.
So we have to be very careful with our translations.
And I think it's also the language and tone of the press releases. For example, if you are to reach out to the healthcare media in Korea, for example, it's not sufficient for us to just, translate it word for word. There are salutations that you will need to include in a press release, for example, and that would complicate matters. So if you're just sending it to a translator, for example, then you might not get the flavor of what you need to communicate, or because you don't include the salutations, you don't include perhaps like an opening paragraph talking about you've covered this story, for example, before, which you consider covering this story. So there's certain things that you need to preface press releases for with when you approach certain kinds of media, and it becomes more sensitive. I think when you go out to places like South Korea, you do need to pay attention to the translations a little bit more.
Yeah.
So if the intent is to generate coverage, then you have to be careful about how you balance the subject matter within any document. It's not just press releases, but any document that you send out to the media. You have to remember that the media, or just people who follow the media in general, they're not really interested in products. They're not really interested in events. They're interested in people. And this is the reason why I think that there's so many millions of podcasts are becoming really popular, because it all involves a bunch of people sitting around talking about certain topics, like key opinion leaders on certain topics, and that's why they're popular, is because people are interesting. What they have to say is interesting. Yeah.
I think one thing about press releases is sometimes I have to tell clients that really it's not worth sending a press release. So, especially for our science, medical type clientele, they may be very excited about something and find it endlessly fascinating, but I have to say to them, the rest of the world is not going to be interested, and they, sure, I'll take the money and write you a press release and release it, but if I honestly don't think we're going to get a pickup or any interest, then I will have to tell the client, I save your money. This is not newsworthy.
Yep. And it's also about the relevance. The relevance of the subject matter to the journalist is important. I mean, not just about targeting the press release to the beat, like the beat of the journalist, but also to kind of shape the coverage, or shape the request for coverage. I don't even call it a press release, request for coverage, or like a story idea, such that they would be more amenable to run it. So if you are reaching out to a social media editor, I would not be sending like a 3-page press release with references. I'll be sending like a story idea, and attach it with maybe a few different potential infographics, for example. And maybe we can go on to like we've been sending press releases for like 15 years or more now. Do you think journalists actually read them?
Oh gosh, that's the $1 million question, isn't it? Um, I'm always seeing research and things which says journalists only read the first paragraph. And to be honest, I think that most journalists, the majority of press releases, they have only read the email subject matter. And if you have not grabbed them with that headline in the email subject matter, they're probably never going to open your email. And then you've got maybe a sentence to grab their attention. So I think that's the most important part of any press release, really.
The other thing I would like to talk about, it also depends on who's sending the press release, right? So for movers and shakers, like say for example in tech, if Facebook or Google issues a press release, you sit up and pay attention. So how does that play in whether or not you should send out a press release? What are your thoughts on that?
That goes back to what I was saying. Just because you find it or the client finds it fascinating doesn't necessarily mean everybody else does. So yeah, sure, if you're Google or Ferrari and you have a new product, everybody's going to be hanging on your press release. But for the rest of the world, that's not necessarily the case.
Yes, and journalists do skim through press releases or any document that you send them. And I think, like you're right, even if you can't condense all the information in the first paragraph or in the header of the email, you do need to be able to lead them into the main subject. So I mean, don't spend too much time into that. Maybe like use the first paragraph to lead them in. It's really essential for them to at least have a general idea within the first like 3 seconds of reading reading your email or the head of your email before they decide whether or not to cover your story. And one of the things that I believe is my feedback or my barometer if we've been sending out good pitching documents or press releases, if the media actually retains our story angle or press release like for months after the news has run or the news cycle has run. And I've known journalists have come to me and asking me like, oh, do you still represent so and so, can we organize an interview with this person? So I find that to me personally, it is it's a form of flattery. I mean, it flatters me. Yeah.
I think you're correct. There is, because you have to grab their attention, there's kind of unwritten rules which most PR agencies follow about how you structure a press release. So as I said, you have that headline or email subject matter, and then when they open that email, you really have to have, I call it a pull out, some people call it a deck. There's 3 or 4 really key points that you put up top, right? So that the journalist can see that and go, well, that might be interesting. I'll read the first paragraph and see what comes next. And then in the first paragraph, we're going to do the journalist's trick, tell them what we're going to tell them, and then tell them what you've just told them, the summation.
And I think good writing is also really underrated. Even today when I go online to read press releases that have been issued by other PR agencies, hint, hint, you do see some very convoluted writing or, structure. And it's partly because, I mean, we don't blame them. They might be in a rush to release something. But I think, and AI has come on board as well in terms of helping people structure their text. But you still need a very good writer to be able to do all those things that would capture journalists' interest and to capture their interest enough that it would be, like saving your pitches long after you've issued them. So in conclusion, the press release does have its place. It does have its place in the PR toolkit. It's just a matter of how you structure it and the use that it's meant for. And it's like you said, it's great for time sensitive announcements, particularly to do with, like, say, crisis communications, to do with product launches or like announcements of executive appointments, for example. But for everything else, I mean, there are many, many ways of pitching a story idea, and which can be further tailored for different kinds of editors and journalists, especially now that we are moving more and more towards social media. So there are journalists that do nothing but social media live streams these days, and there are journalists that do just social media platforms, like Facebook, Instagram, Meta, and TikTok, for example. So as the platforms increase, we will have to tailor the press material to suit the individual target audiences. And it's not just the beat, but it's also the format of the news and the coverage that they generate. I think that's all for now. Thank you for listening.